welcome to the Labor Force Podcast. Stories of the working class in a time of renewed labor militancy and awareness that capitalism is a rotten deal. I'm your host, Mike Strugan, proud member of New York State United Teachers.
This is a desperate, immoral act in the hopes that he can score a victory and be declared war president. And this political trick will generate support. I truly believe that enough people in this country have learned the lessons of the Vietnam War, of the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, and the other unnecessary and illegal wars, that we can say loud and clear, we, the people of the United States, are here to tell the Trump administration, you may wage this war in our names, but not with our consent. Trump is a sad, unhinged man. He is at war on many fronts. He is at war against democracy. He is at war against our constitutional rights, especially our First Amendment right, free speech and free assembly. He's at war against those of us who believe that the right to engage in dissent is what democracy is all about. He is at war against immigrant families. He is very definitely at war against the environment and is now vastly accelerating climate catastrophe. He's taken away every effort to stop corporate polluters from poisoning our air and poisoning our water. We are here today, and thank you for being here, and we will be in the streets tomorrow and in the coming days and weeks to demand that this new war in the Middle East end. To demand an end to the war against the First Amendment. We are going to be using our collective power to end this war and to fight for and save democracy.
That was Jane Fonda, still fiery, still kicking, from a recent rally in L.A. All right, so let's set the scene for what's actually happening with this U.S.-Israeli war in Iran. We launched a joint military operation that Trump branded Operation Epic Fury. In practice, that meant missile strikes on cities across Iran. Hundreds of civilians have already been killed, including kids at an elementary school that was bombed. So this isn't just precision strikes on military targets. This is an imperialist act of war that's hitting regular people. One of the biggest escalations, of course, was the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, along with other top figures in the regime. You think that might totally shatter the state, but from what's been reported, the regime has managed to hold on and keep control, and Iran has hit back. They're striking Gulf countries that host U.S. military bases, trying to widen the cost of this war for Washington and for Israel. Now, this didn't just come out of nowhere. For years, we've had so-called maximum pressure on Iran, brutal economic sanctions, earlier limited military attacks like the 12-Day War, and attempts to twist popular protests inside Iran into tools for regime change. The goal from the U.S. and Israel has been pretty consistent. Weaken Iran as a regional power that can put any kind of check on U.S. and Israeli dominance in the Middle East. Trump's current line is basically, Iran has to completely abandon its nuclear program. In reality, that would strip Iran of any real sovereignty. And at the same time, he doesn't seem to have a clear long-term plan. Khamenei is gone, but the state hasn't collapsed. Trump called on Iranians to overthrow the regime. That didn't happen. And now he's already fishing around for negotiations to get out of this quickly. Iran, for its part, is refusing that and trying to escalate toward a broader regional conflict. Meanwhile, this whole thing is happening on top of a U.S. military machine that's actually showing some strain. The U.S. and Israel both have low missile stockpiles. U.S. naval assets were tied up in the Caribbean when protests broke out in Iran. And even the main U.S. aircraft carrier, the Gerald R. Ford, had these embarrassing delays over something as basic as malfunctioning toilets. So you've got this picture of a state that's still massively powerful, but also overextended and glitchy. Even with those weaknesses, though, the balance of forces still favors Washington. The U.S. has the biggest military on Earth, way beyond Iran's, and huge economic leverage. Arab regimes are helping intercept Iranian counterattacks. European powers like France, the UK, and Germany are backing U.S. defensive operations. Canada, Australia, they're lining up too. And the media, from mainstream outlets to the Wall Street Journal, have been accepting or even praising the assassination and the strikes. Democrats, for the most part, agree that Iran has to be contained and that U.S. primacy in the region has to be preserved. Their main move is to talk about Congress reasserting war powers, not to question the basic idea that Iran is this permanent threat. Polls show that only about 21% of Americans actually support striking Iran, but roughly half say Iran's nuclear program is a really serious threat, and around 6 in 10 see Iran as an enemy. So people are wary of another war, but a lot of them still buy the deeper security narrative that justifies U.S. dominance. That gap, that contradiction between low support for the strike and a lingering acceptance of the Iran as the enemy story, creates an opening. It means there's room to build a mass anti-war response if we can challenge that whole imperial framework instead of just arguing over Trump's tactics or timing. So let's talk about how socialists actually look at this war and where the working class fits in. Iran is a regional power. It's got serious military capabilities compared to its neighbors. It's got massive oil reserves, and it can choke off global trade at the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, it's a country that's oppressed by U.S. imperialism. The U.S. has bases, troops, and military assets all over the region. Israel's sitting there as a nuclear-armed attack dog, run by a government that's even more aggressive about overthrowing Iran. And Iran's been hammered economically through sanctions and military pressure. That's important because it means you can hold two things together at once. One, the Iranian regime is repressive and absolutely not something socialists want to politically support. Two, in this specific conflict, the U.S. and Israel are the imperialist aggressors, and socialists argue for their defeat in this war drive, while staying totally independent from the agenda of the Iranian state. You don't need to pick between Team Trump and Netanyahu or Team Tehran. You pick the side of working and oppressed people, in Iran and in the U.S., against imperialism. Now, how does the working class actually come into this in a concrete way? War is not just missiles and speeches. It's oil production, shipping, logistics, arms manufacturing, military bases, public services. Every missile has to be produced by someone, transported by someone, fueled by someone, coordinated through communications and infrastructure that workers keep running. If those workers refuse or even slow things down, it can throw the entire war machine off balance. Think about all the sectors that get mentioned when people talk about resistance to Trump and the far right. You've got the movement for Palestine that's mobilized huge numbers. You've got NGOs and communities fighting ICE. In Detroit, you had an anti-ICE movement strong enough that the police chief almost fired 2 officers just for collaborating with Border Patrol during traffic stops. On campuses, people have organized around ICE abductions, like the case of Columbia student Eli Agayevna, and around Palestine, and around anti-racist struggles. All of that points to a basic fact. When workers and students get organized where they actually have leverage, on the job, on campus, they can force institutions to back off, even if only partially, from their most repressive practices. If you scale that up and connect it to an anti-war perspective, you start to see the outlines of how the same class that makes this imperialist system function can also disrupt it. Labor has a special role here because of how strategic it is. It's crystal clear. We need an anti-war and anti-imperialist movement from our workplaces and schools, and labor has to play a leading role because it has the power to literally grind imperialism to a halt. That's not a metaphor. If you imagine workers in transport, in ports, in energy, in arms-related industries, in public sector roles that service military infrastructure, if those people start to say, we're not going to quietly enable this war on Iran, the cost of continuing the war rises fast for the ruling class. So the question becomes, how do we move from scattered protests and moral outrage to an organized working class force that can act on that power, while keeping a clear stance against U.S. and Israeli imperialism and also independent from the Iranian regime? Well, the idea is not just more protests. It's coordinated mass action, strikes, walkouts, blockades, days of disruption that hit the system where it hurts. Picture this. Instead of just a rally on a Saturday, you've got union locals calling for work stoppages against the war, teachers stepping out with their students to connect what they're learning about imperialism to what's happening to kids in Iran right now, transit workers slowing or halting services tied to military logistics, campus workers and students walking out together, linking no war in Iran with demands around ICE, police presence on campus, and attacks on immigrant students. You'd also have community organizations and movements that are already in motion. No Kings protests, Palestine solidarity groups, anti-ICE networks, coordinating around shared days of action. Maybe that looks like synchronized protests at military recruitment centers, or disruptions at politicians' offices who are backing this war while pretending to be the adults in the room. The key is, it's not just symbolic. It's about interfering with the normal functioning of the imperialist machine. And for that to work, you need independent working-class politics. Democrats are mostly trying to channel anger into Congress, reclaiming its war powers. But that still accepts the idea that Iran is this permanent threat and that U.S. dominance over the Middle East is normal. On the other side, you've got a MAGA-aligned anti-war current, figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Tucker Carlson, that complains about paying for wars that supposedly help foreign interests, but does it from a nationalist defend real Americans angle. Neither of those is a real alternative. An independent, anti-imperialist labor movement would break with both. It would say, we oppose this war, not because it's too expensive or badly managed, but because the entire imperialist project, the bases, the sanctions, the bombings, the coups, the ICE raids at home, is built on exploiting and controlling working and oppressed people across borders. And that's where linking struggles becomes crucial. The same state that's bombing Iran is caging immigrants, backing Israel's assault on Palestinians, enforcing austerity in cities, and targeting protesters. When South Korean socialists or international socialist currents put out declarations against the U.S.-Israeli war in Iran, they're making that connection. The fight against imperialist war is part of a global class struggle. Within any larger movement, the socialist left needs a class-independent perspective, one that fights for the military defeat of the U.S. and Israel in this conflict, while keeping total independence from the Iranian regime. That's a high bar, but it's also a compass. It keeps us from getting pulled into democratic war powers theater on one side or nationalist pseudo-anti-war politics on the other. We're at a moment where there's real danger of this war expanding, but also cracks in the system, military strain, low public support, disagreement even inside the right. That's exactly when a mass anti-imperialist movement rooted in labor and youth can make a difference. Moving on, something important just happened in the AI debate, and most people missed why it matters. For years, corporate America spoke about AI using careful language. It will assist workers. It will enhance productivity. It will create new opportunities. Then Jack Dorsey did something unusual. He told the truth, at least from Capital's perspective. His company, Block, the parent company of Square and Cash App, eliminated roughly 4,000 jobs, about 40% of its workforce, explicitly arguing that advances in AI allow smaller teams to do more work. And investors rewarded the decision immediately, sending the stock sharply higher. Not bankruptcy, not recession, not falling demand, productivity. That moment matters because it breaks a long-standing corporate taboo. Executives have quietly automated work for decades, but they almost never say, we replace workers with technology. And once one major CEO proves Wall Street rewards AI-driven layoffs, every executive now faces the same incentive. Cut labor, or risk falling behind competitors who do. Meanwhile, here in New York, lawmakers are reacting to something revealing. The state is considering legislation that would require companies filing mass layoff notices to disclose whether AI played a role in job losses, formally tracking AI displacement for the first time. Think about that for a second. Government policy has already moved past the question, will AI affect jobs? Now the question is, how do we measure how many workers disappear? Because here's the catch. Even where disclosure rules already exist, almost no company admits AI caused layoffs, despite widespread automation inside firms. Public explanation, restructuring, internal reality, automation. And this is where the debate gets more complicated, because not everyone thinks this outcome is inevitable. A recent analysis in The New Yorker asks a question most tech coverage skips entirely. Can AI actually be pro-worker? Economists like Darren Asamoglu, David Autor, and Simon Johnson argue that AI's impact isn't predetermined. Technology can either replace labor or increase the value of human expertise, depending on policy choices, incentives, and power relationships. In other words, AI itself isn't the decision. Who controls AI deployment is the decision. Companies currently have strong incentives to build automation that reduces payroll, because labor is a cost and software scales infinitely. But a different path exists. AI that expands worker skills. AI that creates new tasks instead of eliminating them. AI designed to complement labor rather than substitute for it. The economist's warning is blunt. Without intervention, AI will likely concentrate wealth and shrink labor's share of income. So now we're living through a fork in economic history. On one side, a profitable company cuts 40% of its workforce because algorithms make humans optional. On the other, policymakers scrambling just to count the casualties. And somewhere in between sits the uncomfortable truth. Technology has never determined the future of work, power has. So let's stop pretending this is just a technology story. It isn't. AI didn't wake up one morning and decide to fire thousands of workers. Executives, investors, and owners did. Every time a company replaces workers with AI while profits rise, we're watching the same decision capitalism has always made. Productivity gains go up, labor gets cut. And what makes this moment different, what makes it dangerous, is that AI doesn't just threaten factory jobs or warehouse labor. It targets the professional class. Analysts, coders, designers, teachers grading papers at midnight, office workers who were told for 40 years, get educated and you'll be safe. Now the promise is breaking in real time. Because under our economic system, technology is not deployed to reduce human struggle, it's deployed to reduce labor costs. That's the incentive structure. And when a CEO announces layoffs caused by AI and the stock price jumps, the message spreads instantly across corporate America. Fire faster, automate sooner, reward shareholders. This isn't innovation, it's extraction. And here's the truth nobody in Davos panels or TED Talks wants to say out loud. If AI makes workers dramatically more productive, society should become richer together. We should work fewer hours, retire earlier, live better lives. Instead, we're being told to prepare for permanent insecurity while productivity explodes. Why? Because ownership hasn't changed. The machines got smarter, the power structure didn't. And that means the coming conflict isn't human versus machine. It's labor versus capital, again. Only this time, capital owns intelligence itself. The same people who automated factories are now automating thought. And unless workers organize around how AI is introduced into workplaces, unless unions, policymakers, and workers themselves demand a say, AI will not free humanity from work. It will free corporations from workers. So understand what's actually happening right now. New York lawmakers trying to track AI layoffs? That's not regulation, that's early warning. Because history shows us something simple. When technology concentrates wealth faster than democracy can respond, social stability breaks. The middle class shrinks, anger rises, politics radicalizes. Not because people fear the future, but because they realize the future is being taken from them. The ruling idea of this moment is that AI progress is inevitable. Maybe it is, but exploitation is not. Who benefits from AI is still an open question, and that answer will not come from Silicon Valley. It will come from workers deciding whether they are passengers in this economy or participants with power. Because if intelligence itself becomes automated, then the last thing workers can afford to outsource is solidarity. Add to that, more union busting, a 1-2 punch from both the feds and at the state level. The AP reports that the U.S. Treasury Department has terminated collective bargaining agreements covering unionized employees at both the IRS and the Bureau of the Fiscal Service, marking an escalation in the Trump administration's broader effort to assert greater control over the federal workforce. Agency leadership informed workers that the terminations were carried out under authority granted by a March 2025 executive order directing agencies to end union contracts. In a letter to employees, IRS Chief Human Capital Officer Alex Queskin said the move, quote, deepens our commitment of operating as one IRS, a collaborative team focused on serving American taxpayers. The action followed guidance from the Office of Personnel Management instructing agencies to notify unions that they were terminating applicable collective bargaining agreements. But the National Treasury Employees Union, NTEU, is pushing back, arguing that union rights at the agency remain legally intact. NTEU National President Doreen Greenwald emphasized that the union does not recognize the termination as valid, stating, quote, we've been here for decades, we're not going anywhere, and adding that the union will continue serving as the federal workers' representative voice. According to the union, the IRS lacks the authority to unilaterally cancel the agreement, and ongoing litigation will determine whether the executive actions targeting federal sector bargaining rights can ultimately stand. Union leaders maintain that existing labor law still requires agencies to bargain with certified employee representatives and that negotiated protections remain in force unless the courts rule otherwise. In Florida, lawmakers are advancing legislation that labor advocates warn could significantly weaken and potentially eliminate many public sector unions in the state by making it far more difficult for them to maintain certification. The bill, backed by that snake Governor Ron DeSantis and supported by anti-union groups such as the Freedom Foundation, would require public employee unions to maintain higher membership thresholds and face stricter recertification rules, placing unions that fall short at risk of dissolution. The bill mandates labor unions must have approval of 50% plus one of all workers in the bargaining unit, including those who do not vote to maintain certification. In a 3-hour hearing, workers argue that the requirement creates an unfair standard not employed in any other kind of election. It effectively counts non-votes as no votes and makes union certification more difficult. Supporters argue the measure promotes accountability and employee choice. Critics described a death blow to public worker unions, warning that reduced union representation would weaken worker protections, bargaining leverage, and workplace standards across Florida's public workforce. The measure is a follow-up to 2023's SB 256, which requires 60% of union members to pay dues to maintain certification. That bill resulted in the decertification of more than 120 local chapters, representing more than 70,000 public sector workers. So now we need some fight back, and it comes from the beleaguered women of the WNBA.
The lineup after injury. She's a key, and the Dream needed her presence at the point guard.
Green stuffs Onion Welle, and here's Canada in full court. Behind the back to the paint. Jones! And the foul!
You can see Bree Jones even has to cut to her teammate like, I appreciate it.
Here comes the pitch. Burden on Beckers. Flips it up. And a lot of one-pass shot, no-pass shot possessions for New York. Clark, step back three. Oh, she hit it and draws the foul. Welcome back, Caitlin Clark.
Thomas keeps it alive. 8 seconds left. Wickham, another look to tie. You bet! Sammy Wickham has tied it at 79.
Diggins. Agumake. Spinning. Turns. Fades. Gets the bounce. And Seattle gets the win.
Gage Beckers the other way. Beckers has been quiet offensively, just 1 for 3. Working on Talbot behind the back. Step back. It's good. Beckers with the highlight.
And y'all, right now, the crowd is giving home territory.
Minnesota in the penalty. Onesco from Greece. Bucket in the foul. Hamby. Clock winding down. Hamby gets it to Jackson. Jackson inside. Flips it up and in at the horn. Circus shot from Rakia Jackson. And the Sparks get a walk-off winner.
Looking at the clock. Plum trying to go to work. 5 seconds left. Plum with 2 seconds. Plum, the runner. Bank shot. She got it. Kelsey Plum with the bank to win it.
Tied at 88. Gray gets it in. Wilson on the drive. The feed. You bet! You bet! Asia Wilson with .1 to go.
This is a league that is somehow having its best moment and its most stressful moment at the exact same time. Right now, the league and its players are in a labor standoff that's been dragging on for about 17 months, and they're staring down a hard date, March 10th. If they don't have at least a term sheet for a new collective bargaining agreement by then, the 2026 season might not start on time. We're talking strike on the player's side, lockout on the owner's side. Either way, it's a shutdown. To see how we got here, you got to roll back to October 2024. That's when the Women's National Basketball Players Association, the WNBPA, decided to opt out of the CBA that was signed in 2020. That deal was supposed to run through 2027. By opting out, the players basically said, we're not waiting 3 more years to renegotiate our value. It moved the expiration up to October 31st, 2025, and guaranteed a confrontation in the 2025-26 window instead of later in the decade. And they didn't do that randomly. The 2024 season was a turning point. You had the superstar rookie class, Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, and others, coming into a league that was already on the upswing. According to the WNBA's own numbers, attendance jumped 48% from the previous year, the highest it had been in more than 2 decades. TV and streaming viewership wasn't up just a little, it was up about 170%. Merchandise sales, the league says those went up around 600%. That's not a gentle rise, that's a rocket. And that rocket was already leaving the launch pad. Since 2021, WNBA ratings had been climbing, with super teams like the Las Vegas Aces and New York Liberty pulling in national attention. In 2022, the league landed a record $75 million in capital funding. By 2023, they hit around 36 million unique viewers, the best since 2008. So if you're a player looking at those graphs, you're thinking, this is when we push. Not in 2027 when the numbers might plateau, but right now. Expansion is the other piece of this growth story. In 2024, Toronto and Portland were awarded franchises, becoming teams 14 and 15. Then came maybe the biggest headline, an 11-year media rights deal with Disney, Amazon, and NBC Universal, reportedly worth about $2.2 billion total, or roughly $200 million a year. For women's pro sports, that's a huge statement. This is no longer niche programming, this is a serious broadcast property. Since that opt-out decision, the growth hasn't slowed. 3 more expansion teams, Cleveland, Detroit, and Philadelphia, are slated to join the league by 2030, each paying around $250 million just for the right to exist. In 2025, the WNBA set an all-time attendance record, over 3.1 million fans in the buildings, and ESPN drew its highest regular season and postseason WNBA audiences ever. Franchise values followed. The New York Liberty are now pegged at around $450 million, more than 30 times what their current majority owners paid in 2019. The Golden State Valkyries came in hot in 2025, sold out all 17 home games, and are valued at about $500 million. So the players see all of this, attendance spikes, ratings records, billion-dollar media money, expansion checks, and they say, we're the labor that makes this possible. We want a bigger piece and better conditions. So last summer, when negotiations were crawling, they took that message public. At the All-Star Game, players wore shirts that said, "Pay us what you owe us," and held signs with that same phrase while awards were handed out in prime time. Nafees Hakalier, who was a union vice president, went straight at Commissioner Kathy Engelbert in October, saying the league had the best players and the best fans, but, quote, the worst leadership in the world. That's not coded language. That's frustration boiling over. Meanwhile, at the bargaining table, the clock kept ticking. Again, the CBA technically expired October 31st, but both sides agreed to keep operating under the old terms while they talked, what's called a status quo period. They already blew past that October date in an extension that ran through January 9th. Now the league has drawn a hard line. If there isn't a term sheet by March 10th, they're saying the May 8th season tip-off is in real danger. And here's why that date matters so much. There's a ton of logistical stuff that has to happen before opening weekend. There's an expansion draft for Portland and Toronto. More than 80% of WNBA players are free agents, but teams are not allowed to negotiate new contracts until the new CBA is in place. The college draft is on the calendar for April 13th. Training camps are supposed to open around April 19th. Normally, the WNBA has October to April, 6 months, to sort all of this out. This time, everything's crammed into maybe 5 weeks after an agreement, if they even get one. If they don't, the players can walk and call a strike, or the owners can lock them out. Either way, that 30th WNBA season, which was supposed to be this big celebratory moment, is suddenly at risk. So underneath all the deadlines and press conferences, this is a classic labor story. Who creates the value, and who actually gets paid? The WNBPA's demands aren't mysterious. They want higher pay, a bigger salary cap, and basic things that sound almost boring until you realize they don't fully exist yet, like guaranteed housing and standardized practice facilities. Let's put some numbers on it. Under the old CBA, the top standard contract, the Supermax, was about $249,000 a year. The top rookie scale deal was somewhere around $78,000. That's before taxes, before agent fees, for players who are literally among the best basketball players on the planet. In their latest proposal, the union is pushing for a first-year team salary cap somewhere around $9.5 million. They also want team-provided housing back on the books. That was part of the very first CBA back in 1999, but has eroded over time. On top of that, they're asking for stronger pensions, pregnancy protections in trades, and real standardized facilities instead of this patchwork of who has a good owner and who doesn't. The biggest flashpoint, though, is revenue sharing. Under the most recent deal, WNBA players have been getting less than 10% of league revenue. Compare that to the NBA, where players were in the neighborhood of a 50+% share of basketball-related income. The WNBPA's February proposal says we want 25% of gross revenue in year one and an average of about 26% over the life of the new agreement. Gross is important. That's the money coming in before you subtract expenses like travel, marketing, or arena costs. The union had originally asked for an average of around 31% over the life of the CBA, so this 26% number is already a step down from where they started. The league has come back with its own framing. They say they're offering players more than 70% of net revenue, so what's left after expenses. When you translate that into gross terms, it works out to less than 15% of the top-line number. For 2026, the league's proposal would bump the salary cap to about $5.75 million per team, up from roughly $1.5 million in 2025. That's a big jump on paper. They floated a maximum salary around $1.3 million for 2026, with projections that it could approach $2 million by 2031. Average salaries, they say, would go from around $120,000 in 2025 to $540,000 in 2026, and up to about $780,000 by 2031. From ownership's perspective, those look like huge raises. Some owners have called the union's ask unrealistic and warned that it would lead to hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. The league also pushes back on the idea that they're hiding the books, saying they provide audited financial statements and detailed revenue share calculations every year, and that the union has the right to run its own audit. From the players' side, the question is different. If the league is finally generating serious money, why are we still talking about them getting under 15% of gross revenue? The union points out that 2025 was the first time the old revenue-sharing trigger even kicked in, and that produced about $8 million to be divided among the players who were under contract that season. That's a nice bonus, but it's also a sign that the economics of the league have shifted into a new tier, and that the current split doesn't match that reality. What really changes the power dynamic here is that players now have alternatives and proof of value. We already talked about franchise valuations. On top of that, you have Unrivaled, the 3-on-3 league founded by Breanna Stewart and Nafisa Collier down in Miami. Since January, almost 50 WNBA stars have been playing there. Some of them are making more than their WNBA salaries and getting equity stakes in the league itself. One detail really cuts through the noise. Chelsea Gray, the Las Vegas Aces guard, won a one-on-one tournament in Unrivaled and took home about $200,000 for 31 minutes of basketball. That's more than her WNBA base salary last year, which was around $196,000. When union leaders say, "We don't think what we're asking for is unfair," that's what they're pointing to. The talent has options. The sport is generating serious money. And yet, in the WNBA's main system, the people on the court are still getting a very small slice of the pie they're baking. And if you zoom out from the spreadsheets, what's happening in the WNBA is part of a bigger story about women's sports and work. For decades, women athletes have heard the same line: be patient. When the ratings go up, when the crowds show up, when there's proof you're profitable, the money will come. Men's leagues never really had to clear that bar in the same way. The NBA and NFL didn't wait for perfect profitability before they started cutting players in as real partners. So however this CBA fight ends, whether there's a last-minute deal before March 10th, or a messy delay, or a full-blown work stoppage, it's going to set expectations far beyond one season. If WNBA players can win a meaningful share of gross revenue and better protections, that becomes a template for women's soccer, women's hockey, new women's leagues we haven't even seen yet. If they're told again to be patient, to accept a tiny slice while valuations and media deals soar, that sends its own message about where women's labor sits in the sports economy. We'll keep following it as it plays out over the next few weeks, because it's bigger than one league. It's a test case for whether women's sports in this new record-breaking era come with record-breaking deals for the workers, or just record-breaking headlines for everyone else. Now let's get into a pretty big question. What if the problem isn't just inequality or just the climate crisis, but the economic model that's driving both at the same time? A UN expert, Olivier de Schutter, who focuses on extreme poverty and human rights, is arguing that the way we structure the global economy right now basically serves the frivolous and destructive demands of the ultra-rich, while leaving workers underpaid and the planet on fire. So picture how resources get used in most rich countries. We have capital, land, skilled labor, technology, and instead of pointing that toward everybody having safe housing, good public transit, reliable health care, we pour a massive amount of it into luxury. The shooter uses very concrete examples, building giant mansions instead of social housing, or designing more powerful private cars instead of public transportation systems. From his perspective, that's not just morally off, it's economically grossly inefficient because those same resources could be used to meet basic needs that right now just aren't being met. And this is where inequality and ecological collapse show up as two sides of the same coin. When you chase growth at all costs, and you let the ultra-rich set the tone for what gets produced, you get an economy that's laser-focused on high-end consumption. Bigger houses, more flights, more resource-intensive toys, you name it. That boosts profits for corporations and adds to GDP, sure, but it also ramps up emissions and pollution. Meanwhile, workers at the bottom are stuck with precarious jobs, low wages, and basic services that are underfunded because the focus has been on expanding markets and profits, not on guaranteeing a decent life for everyone. The shooter's point is that the scarce resources we have should be used to prioritize the basic needs of people in poverty and to create things of real social value. Right now, the model does the opposite. We accept, almost as a law of nature, that if we just grow the economy, maybe something will trickle down. But what that often means in practice is catering to the spending habits of the richest households, hoping that a few crumbs reach all the people below. Now, if you zoom out to the global level, especially low-income and developing countries, the trap gets even more brutal. The shooter's been to a lot of these countries since 2020, and he says they're locked into an economic model that forces them to pursue a destructive kind of growth, mainly so they can service foreign debt. To pay those debts, they have to export. And to export, they have to produce what big buyers and global supply chains demand, not what their own populations actually need, and definitely not what would make ecological sense locally. So instead of investing first in food systems that feed their own people, or in climate-resilient infrastructure, or in public services, they're pushed to prioritize cash crops, cheap manufacturing, or resource extraction because that's what global buyers are paying for. The result, as the shooter describes it, is pretty predictable. Ecological destruction, low wages, minimal investment that actually sticks around in those communities. Workers end up in unsafe conditions and jobs that are highly exposed to climate shocks. Think agriculture in areas already getting hammered by drought or floods, and with almost no cushion when something goes wrong. And here's the kicker. That whole system is still framed as growth. GDP goes up when exports go up, but the benefits are skewed toward multinational corporations and the ultra-rich owners and investors at the top of those supply chains, while the people doing the work and living with the environmental fallout get the short end of the stick. The shooter argues that we need a different kind of growth in these countries, driven by domestic demand and regional South-South trade, rather than just plugging into North-South supply chains that mainly serve rich consumers. So when he says our current model will inevitably fail to satisfy the basic needs of people living on low incomes, that's what he's talking about. You can't build an economy around luxury mansions, sports cars, and endlessly expanding exports for the global elite, and then be surprised when people in precarious work, whether that's a garment worker, a farm worker, or someone in a climate-vulnerable coastal job, are still struggling just to get by. The growth at all costs model is doing exactly what it's designed to do, maximize returns for the top, even if that means burning through ecosystems and burning out workers. Alright, so if the current system is built to serve the ultra-rich and is driving both inequality and ecological collapse, what does an alternative even look like? The shooter's working on what he calls a roadmap for eradicating poverty beyond growth. The core idea is to stop treating GDP, the total market value of everything produced, as the main scoreboard for success, and instead build an economy that's redistributive and sustainable by design. He's not alone in this. There's an informal Beyond Growth coalition behind the roadmap, with UN agencies, academics, civil society groups, and unions involved. And this roadmap is supposed to land alongside two other big initiatives, one from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on replacing GDP as the key measure of economic success, and another from a G20 panel on global inequality led by economist Joseph Stiglitz. So there's kind of a convergence here. A lot of people in the system know the growth obsession isn't working, even if they haven't always been able to say that out loud. Now, what does beyond growth actually mean in practice? The shooter is pretty clear that he's not talking about recession or chaos. He explicitly says we need to avoid the confusion between a crash like 2008 or 1929 and a carefully planned and democratically controlled transition to something else. That something else is an economy where we measure and organize around well-being. Things like access to health care, education, housing, ecological stability, instead of just counting how many dollars worth of stuff was sold. His roadmap looks at a set of tools governments and international institutions could use. A few he highlights are universal basic income, job guarantees, debt cancellation, and an extreme wealth tax. The idea is to expand the menu of options so policymakers aren't stuck choosing between grow or die. Instead, they can directly tackle poverty and inequality. Let's hit how you'd pay for that, because it's always the first pushback. De Schutter's argument is that public revenue shouldn't mainly come from taxing labor and broad economic activity. Right now, a lot of states lean heavily on income taxes on workers or consumption taxes. He says instead we should raise revenue by taxing wealth and harmful activities, things like large financial assets, immovable property, financial transactions, and the ills of the economy, especially fossil fuels or other extractive industries. In other words, tax the stock of extreme wealth and the damage being done, not just every paycheck. If you combine that with tools like universal basic income and job guarantees, you start to see the outline of a different model. UBI would give everyone a basic floor of income, reducing the constant fear that comes with precarious work. Job guarantees would mean the state steps in to provide socially useful, decent work, say in care, infrastructure, or ecological restoration, when the private sector doesn't. Debt cancellation, especially for poorer countries, would free up their budget so they can invest in hospitals, schools, and climate-safe infrastructure instead of just funneling money back to creditors. But De Schutter's thinking goes beyond national policies. He's calling for a permanent UN body dedicated to fighting inequality, something modeled on the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. The IPCC doesn't make laws, but it does gather scientific evidence and outline policy pathways, and that shaped global climate negotiations for decades. He wants a similar body for inequality that would collect not just data on what's happening, but also evidence on which policy tools actually reduce poverty and let societies achieve well-being without growth or with much lower growth. If that kind of body existed and had political traction, it could reshape global rules around trade, debt, and development. For example, instead of trade rules that mostly protect the interests of large corporations and importing countries, you could get a framework that prioritizes domestic needs in exporting countries and respects ecological limits. Instead of debt regimes that push countries to an over-export at any cost, you could have coordinated debt relief linked to investments in public services and sustainable development. And development policy in general could be judged less on how much GDP went up and more on whether people actually escaped poverty and whether ecosystems were protected. De Schutter thinks this moment, with his roadmap plus the Gutierrez and Stiglitz initiatives, is a chance for high-profile figures to come out of the closet on questioning growth. And he's very explicit about the stakes. If we don't manage to build a post-2030 agenda that reconciles planetary boundaries with social justice, he warns that far-right populists will fill the gap, feeding off people's anger and insecurity. So the Beyond Growth agenda isn't some abstract academic thing. It's about offering a credible, fair alternative before frustration gets weaponized in really ugly ways. So how does all this land for workers, especially the folks in informal work, care work, or industries already getting hit by climate change? Let's start with universal basic income and job guarantees, because together they change the power balance on the shop floor and in the labor market. If you have a guaranteed basic income, you're less desperate. That doesn't magically fix everything, but it means walking away from a dangerous factory job or refusing unpaid overtime becomes more thinkable. Add a job guarantee on top, where the public sector offers decent, socially useful work at a living wage, and suddenly employers can't rely on a permanent pool of people who accept anything out of fear. Workers in informal sectors, like street vending or domestic work, would know there's at least a public option backing them up if their income collapses or if climate shocks wipe out their livelihoods. For care workers, who are often underpaid or not paid at all, job guarantees could be transformative. Governments could recognize care as essential social infrastructure and fund stable unionized roles in childcare, elder care, disability support. That not only improves services but gives workers in those sectors real leverage. They're in publicly backed jobs, not just stuck in fragmented, precarious gigs. Now, the funding side connects back to the shooter's push for wealth taxes and taxing destructive economic activity. If states raise revenue from large fortunes, financial assets, big property holdings, and fossil fuel extraction, they can channel that money into green public investment and strong public services instead of subsidizing luxury emissions. So instead of tax systems that are easy on wealth but heavy on working incomes, you flip it. The ultra-rich and polluting industries carry more of the load, and that finances things like UBI, job guarantees, social housing, and clean public transport. That also opens space for what you could call local or social economies. If people have income security, and if there's public investment in things like community infrastructure, small-scale agriculture, or local care networks, then not every job has to be dictated by global supply chains chasing the cheapest labor. The shooter talks about encouraging regional integration and South-South trade, basically building up economic links within and between poorer countries so their growth is driven more by domestic and regional needs than by serving northern consumer markets. That shift would give workers and communities more say in what gets produced and how. In terms of real-world labor struggles and climate justice movements, these ideas line up with what a lot of workers and activists are already demanding, even if they're not always using the phrase beyond growth. When workers push for better public services, when communities resist destructive extraction projects, when climate campaigns insist on a transition that doesn't just dump costs on miners, farmers, or coastal workers, that's the same basic logic. The economy should serve people and respect planetary limits, not the other way around. The shooter's proposals give these struggles a framework at the global level. A permanent UN body on inequality, backed by evidence on what actually works, could give unions and social movements more leverage in global debates about trade rules, debt workouts, and development finance. If a country wants to cancel or restructure a debt so it can invest in climate-safe jobs and public services, it helps to point to a UN process saying, yeah, this is what a just transition looks like. For unions and worker organizations, a worker-led transition beyond growth would probably mean a few big demands. 1, guaranteeing income and decent work through things like UBI and job guarantees, so workers aren't forced to choose between a paycheck and a livable planet. 2, taxing wealth and destructive activity to fund high-quality public services, from healthcare and housing to transit and education. And 3, reshaping global rules so countries aren't trapped in debt-driven, export-at-all-cost models that keep wages low and jobs vulnerable to climate shocks. The basic takeaway is that questioning growth isn't about accepting poverty or stagnation. It's about refusing an economic model that sacrifices workers and the planet to the whims of the ultra-rich. The Shutter's roadmap is one attempt to sketch out what comes next. Income security, fair taxation, strong public services, and global rules that put human needs and ecological survival first. So take a step back and look at the pattern. The government launching another war in the Middle East while most people in the country don't even support it. Tech billionaires bragging about firing thousands of workers because AI makes payroll smaller. Politicians quietly tearing up union contracts and rewriting labor law to make organizing harder. Owners in a booming sports league telling the players who built that boom that they should be grateful for scraps. Different stories, same system. And the same message coming from the people at the top every time. Work harder, accept less, don't ask questions. When corporations automate jobs, that's called innovation. When workers ask for a fair share of the wealth they create, suddenly that's called unrealistic. When the government spends billions on missiles and military bases, that's called national security. But when workers demand health care, housing, or a living wage, suddenly there's no money. The rules are very clear. The economy works for the people who own it. And right now, that ownership class is trying to lock in a future where technology replaces workers, unions disappear, and democratic control over the economy shrinks even further. And AI isn't just a technology revolution, it's a power grab. Because if corporations can automate work while keeping ownership concentrated in the same few hands, they don't just control the workplace anymore, they control the future of labor itself. And while that's happening, the same political system that can mobilize enormous resources for war is telling workers to accept austerity, insecurity, and permanent competition with each other. That's not a bug in the system, that is the system. War abroad, union busting at home, automation without worker control, wealth piling up at the top while everyone else is told to be patient. But here's the part they don't like to talk about. The entire structure rests on workers continuing to cooperate with it. Every missile built, every shipment moved, every algorithm deployed, every stadium filled, every tax dollar processed. None of it happens without labor. And when workers realize that power collectively, when they organize, strike, walk out, refuse, balance changes very quickly. That's why unions get attacked. That's why strikes get demonized. That's why politicians and CEOs work so hard to keep workers divided. Because solidarity is the one thing this system can't automate. So the real conflict shaping this century isn't human beings versus machines. It's the same conflict that's been there all along. Labor versus capital. Who controls the technology? Who controls the wealth it produces? And ultimately, who controls the future? Because the billionaires building AI, the politicians funding wars, and the corporations busting unions are all betting on the same thing, that workers will stay isolated. But history suggests that's a dangerous bet, because when workers stop competing with each other and start organizing against the people who profit from that competition, the balance of power in society can change faster than anyone expects. And that's the real story of this moment, not the rise of AI, not the next war, not the latest corporate strategy. The real story is whether the people who make the road run decide they're done asking for permission from the people who own it. Well, that does it for this episode. If you like what you hear, give a rate or review on your favorite podcast app to help me grow. I'm proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, with over 200 labor shows you can check out at laborradionetwork.org. This has been the Labor Force Podcast. I'm Mike Strukin. Solidarity, always.